recording. So welcome again to our web conference today, Back to Basics, What Will It Take to Prevent Sexual and Intimate Partner Violence? My name is Ashley Klein-Jimenez. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Prevention at Valor. And welcome to our web conference today. We're so happy that we're here, that you're here, that we're here too. PreventConnect is a national project of Valor, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government or Valor. So as Janae and I have both said, this is really a foundational prevention web conference. So if you are a seasoned preventionist, there probably won't be anything super new here for you, but we still are so happy that you're here. And this may be a place where we can help with some of those onboarding needs that a lot of us have when we're bringing in new staff to do prevention work. So we are going to work on defining primary prevention, describing how environments influence behavior, describe some examples of prevention in practice and happening in the real world, and then identify some resources to help expand prevention knowledge. That's what we're here to do today.
Awesome. So language is really important. If anyone here is just kind of stepping into their first professional prevention role, you might have noticed that the field uses really weird language, and it can be kind of gatekeepy. So things like social ecological model, public health approach, risk and protective factors, science, technical packages, all the things. And we're going to try to stay away from that language for the most part today. So obviously a part of breaking down gatekeeping is giving people information and definitions to navigate those systems. That's really important. And the most powerful pieces of prevention don't necessarily have those big academic words attached to them. Communities have been doing prevention for a long time without calling it prevention, especially communities of color. But when we professionalized the movement and when we started putting a lot more academic dollars behind the movement, things started getting a lot more public healthy. And we'll talk about public health approaches a little bit in this web conference, but we really want to empower you with the knowledge that, whether you're brand new to this job or you're not, you are an expert on prevention. You just may not have been using the language that people in professional spaces are using right now. We hosted a web conference earlier this year on health equity in practice, kind of breaking down language barriers. And we asked people what prevention actually meant to them. So taking out all of those big words, when we say, what does it take to prevent sexual violence? What does that mean? And the main things that we got were things like equity, understanding, empathy, respect, resources, connection, collaboration, relationships, accountability, good jobs, affordable housing. Even when we're navigating these systems that can feel really hard to understand, I know for myself, every time I've entered a different role in the field of prevention, I feel like I have to have a different dictionary to understand what the people around me are saying. And I have to remind myself that that doesn't make me any less of an expert. It's just about code switching. So we're really grateful that you're here. And just as much as we're providing you with knowledge and resources, we also want to hear that from you. And you are already an expert. So we want to ask you, this is a chance to kind of enter in the chat and interact with each other. What does prevention look like to you? When I say, what does it mean to prevent sexual violence? What is happening around you? What do you think that means? And you can enter things in the chat. We'll kind of keep going in the web conference, and then we'll take a pause later and kind of read what's coming back.
I am really excited to see what folks come up with in the chat. I'm already seeing things that are awesome. One thing that I just absolutely love about prevention is that it really is happening all around us. And sometimes on the days where it feels really hard and like there's not been a lot of progress, I look around my community and I notice the places where there actually is so many awesome things happening that are all moving towards the goal of creating environments where sexual assault and domestic violence are less likely to happen. And so I encourage you all to, many of you probably already do this, but if you haven't, or if you don't, maybe take a look around your community and see all the places where prevention is happening, where it's not necessarily tied to a grant or a nonprofit or an institution, where it's just community members trying to make lives better for themselves and the people around them. And so, I think about things that I see happening in the area where I live. This is an example of neighbors coming together to plant trees. That might be a far reach for some of us to think, like, how is that violence prevention? But what's happening in this situation is that people are connecting. Neighbors are connecting. They are getting to know one another. They are feeling part of a larger community. And so to me, I truly believe that those are all things that need to happen in order for us to prevent violence. So that would be an example that I see. Janae, I'm going to head back over to the chat because there's so much happening, but I see that people are talking about knowledge and education, but people are also talking about, gosh, there's so much stuff. Sorry, mutual aid and building community. Yes, I love that so much. People are talking about, let's see, the chat is just moving so fast, talking about risk factors. People are talking about holistic care. People are talking about creating a culture of care. There's a lot of stuff coming up in here that is really exciting. And I think that is so critical and important because we know that prevention really is going to take all of us, or many of us. So it's so important for us to make prevention as accessible as possible and not have it be something that is just like, you have to have a job in order to participate in prevention, or you have to have a certain education. Everyone can be involved in prevention, and we truly need everyone because it's so dependent on different life experiences and different identities. And so we have to make the concept of prevention accessible, and we can't prevent violence without being able to bring more people along, right? There's 338 people in this Zoom room, which is incredible. And we know that alone, we are not going to solve this problem. So we need more people.
Thanks, Ashley. And so we kind of want to share just very briefly our own path to prevention, because I don't know about any of you, but I did not know what prevention was before I started working in prevention. So, I had, I think, a similar experience to a lot of people. I experienced sexual violence at a young age, so did a lot of people around me. And early on, I thought that healing and prevention just meant telling our stories, telling people's stories, and getting awareness out there. And yeah, that's definitely part of it. People need to be aware of the problem. I was a working journalist before I entered this field, and I mainly covered sexual and domestic violence issues. And I found that year after year, I kept writing these stories and people knew that they were an issue, but nothing ever changes. Or nothing ever changed at the time, at least from what I was putting out. I just felt like I was writing the same stories over and over and over again. And I remember I was a journalist when the Me Too movement happened, and we're going to speak a little bit about the Me Too movement later on in this web conference. And I felt really called to action. And a local rape crisis center posted a prevention job. I didn't know what that meant at the time. I thought it meant giving people knowledge and resources, and that would eventually end the problem. But when I joined that rape crisis center and I did my 65-hour training, and I got a similar training to this, it really opened my eyes to things that happen and can be impacted before violence ever happens. That makes a really big difference. And I know, Ashley, you have a little bit of a different story of how you came to prevention. I would love to hear that.
Yeah, I feel like I've had multiple pathways to prevention, Janae, but I will share here that I started volunteering at my local rape crisis center as a hotline advocate, and thought that that was incredible, and felt like it was a really big responsibility to be witness to someone's trauma, and had so much respect for my fellow advocates, and really the work that people were doing in being part of someone's healing journey. At the same time, I felt like I played that role in my family for many years. And so when I learned about prevention, I was like, oh, actually, I feel like that's where my skill set might be more useful. And the fact that we can prevent people from having to get to the point where there is a healing journey, right? I know that that is kind of like pie in the sky, but ultimately that's our goal, that we don't need crisis hotlines because people aren't in crisis when it comes to sexual and intimate partner violence. And so I really kind of threw myself and my passion into this concept of prevention. And the rest was really history. That was like 20 years ago. So yeah.
And we'd love for you to think a little bit about your own personal path to prevention. So this is just something, if you want to journal about it as we're going through the web conference, if you feel called to share that in the chat, we would love to hear it. But especially this is something that we've been talking a lot more about on the podcast. We have been taught when we are as advocates and preventionists to remove ourselves completely from the movement, that it's all about the survivors that we work with and the communities that we work with. And there is a place for that. But I'm here because I have a personal stake in the game. So does Ashley, and your personal story matters too. So we really want to be intentional with honoring space for that. And I will pass it to Ashley as people are thinking about their personal stories to walk us through the upstream story. Oh, Ashley, you are muted.
Of course I was. Thank you, Janae. So this is definitely a place where many of you may be familiar with the moving upstream story, but it can be really useful to illustrate what we mean by primary prevention. Everyone tells this story a little bit differently. So you may have heard different versions of it. This is my version that's been adapted over the years. I've definitely changed it up as I've gone along. So it's really a story that we get from public health, and it's used a lot to talk about the way we should be thinking about preventing sexual and intimate partner violence. This kind of thinking is often called upstream thinking, and that's where we get the moving upstream story title from. But the story goes like this. One day there's a person fishing by the river and they see someone being swept downstream, and the fisher, doesn't hesitate. They jump in to save the drowning person, and they successfully drag that person to safety on the riverbank. But not even a minute later, another person comes floating down the river. They're calling out for help. They're clearly in distress. And so the fisher saves that person too. But before they even have a chance to sit down, here comes another person, and then 3 more people, and so on and so on. And the fisher is just completely exhausted and out of breath at this point and can't possibly go on like this. So they decide to run upstream, right? They go up the river to see, why are all of these people falling into the river? Why is this happening? When the fisher finally gets upstream, they notice that it's a mess. There's essentially a disaster. The bridge is unsafe. It's falling apart. There's holes in the bridge. There are people pushing other people into the river. There's not just one issue, but there's many issues. And the fisher thinks to themselves that the only way to save people from drowning in the river is to address these issues and prevent people from falling in the first place. So that is our moving upstream story, or the river story. And what that story helps us see is that prevention can take many forms, right? We can think about the fisher being willing to go out into the water and save someone at all, as some of the advocacy work that we do, right? We advocate for people, we provide environments for people to heal and work through the trauma that they've experienced. That could be the advocacy, the fisher going into the river and trying to pull people to safety. We can think of the work that we do in outreach and awareness as, let's say the fisher decided, I'm going to go ahead and post signs, letting people know, hey, upstream, there's a broken bridge. It's dangerous up there. That could be what we consider outreach and awareness. We're making people aware. We're letting people know that there's a problem, and we're making sure that they have the information to try to prevent that. We can think of risk reduction as, in the river story, wonder if we gave everyone flotation devices, right? That would help them hopefully not drown. That's an example of what we would call risk reduction. So in our work to prevent sexual and domestic violence, that might look like, giving people tools to test their drinks when they're out at a bar, alcohol serving establishment. That could be teaching people self-defense. That would be an example of risk reduction. But what we know is that to really get to the main cause, the reason why people are falling in the river in the first place, we have to fix the bridge, right? And so primary prevention would be figuring out what is happening in our environments that is moving people to make choices that are harmful. I think a point here is that there is not one strategy or form of prevention on this screen that will end violence on its own. We really need all of these different forms of prevention, but primary prevention is most often the piece that gets missed. It's often not invested in, or it's seen as kind of the least important. It's the afterthought. And that makes sense in a lot of ways because of how this work is structured. If we're always dealing with people in crisis, obviously we can't put a lot of the time and resources that we need for prevention. And so I see that happening a lot in organizations where the advocate is also the prevention person, right? There are lots of organizations where folks are lucky, and those are two different distinct positions. But if you're the same person, your first duty is responding to a crisis. So that makes a lot of sense when we think about it that way. So want to throw another question out to you all and ask you to kind of think about this river story and those analogies. And think about your community. What does the broken bridge represent in your community? What are the things that you have identified as contributing to the problem of sexual and intimate partner violence? And then what are things that are needed to repair that? What are things that are needed to repair the bridge? So give you a moment to think on that. I see Laurel says poverty. Thank you so much, Laurel. Absolutely. That is huge. We know that poverty is a huge risk factor for sexual and intimate partner violence, both experiencing it and also perpetrating it. I see norms. I see Melissa says broken bridges represent the gaps and barriers between agencies, schools, organizations. Historical trauma. Thank you, Carly, for bringing that into it. Crystal says housing instability. I see more education, poverty, discrimination, normalized violence, absolutely, oppression, absolutely, inequality as a result of colonialism, absolutely. So there are some very, very big systems level and structural things that are happening that are making our bridges unsafe. Absolutely. I'm going to keep going through this because there's a ton. And Janae, if there's any other ones that you want to pull out, please feel free to do so.
Awesome. Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, I see a lot of structural pieces in there too. And that's a really great segue to our next section. So when we talk about prevention, that means that there is a cause, and sexual violence is an effect that was caused. We at PreventConnect really strongly believe that sexual violence doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's a reason that it happens, and that reason can be undone. And the metaphor that I really like to use to kind of think about sexual violence as a symptom is a tree. So imagine a tree in your front yard or wherever you are. I'm looking at a tree in my window right now. And what do trees have on them when it's not winter time? Are a bunch of leaves. So let's say you walk up to a tree and you don't like one of the leaves. Maybe it's discolored or it's starting to fall. So you pluck it off. What happens when you pluck off the leaf? Another leaf grows back. You can spend all your time, similar to the river story, plucking off leaf after leaf after leaf after leaf, but the tree is still there in your yard. You need to zoom out further. Leaves are there because the tree exists. Okay, so we're plucking off leaves, that's not working. Let's cut the tree off at the trunk. Maybe that will solve the problem. It might take longer, but the tree is still there. The problem is still there. If we want to get rid of the tree, we have to look beneath the surface and think about why the tree is growing. So we talk about roots. We call them the roots of violence. What things exist, what systemic and structural pieces exist that allow violence to grow and persist in our communities. And if we really want things to go away and not come back, we have to address the roots. That's a really hard thing for people to do because it takes a lot of creativity. We have to address things that we can't necessarily see, smell, touch, or measure. We have to look at the systems of oppression. And so this is a flow chart that we created earlier this year that will be available on PreventConnect at some point in the future. And, you know, we use this flow chart to kind of talk about what we see versus what we don't see and the causes to the things that we see in our communities. So when I say systems of oppression, I'm talking about racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, classism, heterosexism. These are systems that human beings created to enforce power over certain people. These systems of oppression were created because of a belief that certain people, typically white people, able-bodied people, heterosexual and cisgender people, are superior and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion or detriment of other racial and ethnic groups. Because these systems are created, we don't really interact. You know, I don't walk down the street and say hi to sexism or racism. It exists in the air around me. These are the things that we learn from the moment that we're born. They're reinforced in messages all around us, whether those are our family members, things that we encounter in schools, covert messages that we see in the media, our laws and policies, historical trauma. These are things that we might not recognize that we're learning, but we all do, and they become a part of our bodies and our existence. It's not bad that we have parts of those in ourselves, but it is our responsibility to acknowledge and dismantle them. Because of what we learn, or what we learn creates the conditions in which we live. Because systems of oppression exist, we experience things like income. They affect income and social protection. Who has higher income, who doesn't? They impact housing, working life conditions, social inclusion and non-discrimination. They impact things like job security. Who has job security? Who doesn't have job security? What are the external factors that make it easier for some people to have job security than other people? They impact things like healthcare access, food security, education, environmental and political conflict, and early childhood developments. These are all pieces of our environments. Systems of oppression make up our environments. Again, I might not walk down the street and be super aware of environmental and political conflict happening everywhere in the things that make that up, but those are a part of the environment in which I live. And because those things exist, that creates the social issues that impact us. So the things that we do notice when we walk down the street are things like police brutality, poverty, sexual violence, housing insecurity, discrimination, health disparities, pay inequity, domestic violence, mass incarceration, and the list could go on. These are the social issues that we talk about in the news, that we talk about with our friend groups, that come up over the holidays. But we know that you can't just, let's say that I'm really passionate about housing. I want there to be better housing out there for everyone, which is true. I can't just keep going at housing and making more houses and think that that's going to solve the problem. The housing situation that we're all in right now exists because of our environments, and that exists because of oppression. And the reason that we share that is because we need to think big when we're thinking about prevention. I know that that's a really big and scary concept, because if you were to tell me, you know, congratulations, here's your new job, I need you to now go end racism single-handedly, I think it's impossible. I would crumble under the pressure. But that doesn't mean that we can't all collectively go after that, because as long as we're not trying, no change is ever going to happen. So now that we've looked at that flow chart of the roots of oppression, we're going to go back to that tree. So when we're talking about sexual violence, those are the leaves. Those are the things that we can see. We know that sexual violence happens when we're working in awareness spaces. When I worked in an awareness and advocacy space, I didn't really meet anyone who said, yeah, I want sexual violence to persist in the community. Most people said they knew sexual violence was a problem and they wanted it to stop. It was when we started talking about why sexual violence happened that there were disconnects. Sexual violence exists because people have and abuse power over others, especially women and women of color. Why do some people have power and abuse that power? Because of the systems of oppression. Some people have power because of racism, ableism, classism, sexism, and heterosexism. So if we want people to not have power and abuse that over others, while we can address and mitigate harm in the middle, we have to be thinking big. And we have to think about why those causes exist in the first place. We can't just start pulling roots out. We can't say we want to end racism, so therefore we are going to end racism. It's something that's existed for thousands of years and not something that we can solve overnight. We can, however, think about the conditions that allow racism to continue and persist. So the soil, the conditions that create the tree, what nurtures and permeates oppression, what makes it okay for people to keep acting that way for oppression to happen in our community. So we would love to hear from you, kind of think big now. In your communities, what are the root causes that create conditions for sexual violence? What makes up that soil? What are the social things that exist that allow oppression to continue? And I'll give you just a moment to kind of enter those. I do see, Ashley putting that also in the chat. So I see misogyny and patriarchy, racism, sexism, patriarchy. I see pornography addiction. So like norms and like lack of communication and accurate information about sex and harmful gender norms that exist in some porn. Absolutely. Ethnocentrism. Absolutely. Social inequity, thinking it doesn't happen. So that whole like silence thing, it's a private issue, exists. Colonialism. Absolutely. Machismo, rape culture, abstinence only programming. So colonialism, toxic masculinity. Absolutely. These are really great. And these are things that we can address. I can decide, people are not talking about sex in a pleasure focused and empowering way. So that's something that I want to address in my community. That's a factor that impacts the soil. Thank you.
Thanks, Janae. I'm still looking at the text. There's such rich things coming up in there. So this brings us to this question about what is the difference between raising awareness about something and actually working to prevent it? I think for a long time, when I was doing this work, I really believed that if people just knew the issue, if people just understood how it impacted people and communities, then they wouldn't do it. That was, I don't know, some might say that was a naive thing to think, but I really thought that, right? We just need to give people information. We need to educate them, make them aware, and then we can prevent this. And what I've learned over the years is that there's a big difference between awareness and prevention, and that it actually takes a lot more than just knowing that there's a problem. So in Janae's last metaphor about the tree and the soil, awareness would be us knowing that the soil is bad, right? We know the soil's bad. It doesn't have the nutrients it needs. We're going to figure out how to work with the bad soil. We do this a lot when we're raising awareness about sexual violence and intimate partner violence. It's not that awareness is bad. We need to know these things, right? People need to know that there's a problem in order to address it. But what we really need to do is not figure out how we adapt to the poisonous soil. We need to change the soil. And that's really the work of prevention. So we absolutely need both. What is often lacking is that prevention piece. Oops.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ashley. And I see from Brian too, going back to that upstream story, awareness is a fisherman telling people not to go to the bridge, but not everyone is going to get that message in perpetuity. Prevention is patching up some of those holes so we can minimize the people getting affected in the long run. Absolutely. And Brian, we're going to come back to that too, of the limits of one individual person reaching other individual people. So thank you so much for that. The Me Too movement is a great example to what Ashley was talking about with awareness versus prevention. So during the Me Too movement, what we saw happening was that people in power who were abusing their power were being brought to justice, or the public was moving to bring them to justice with the systems that we had and what we knew about justice at the time. What I noticed was that sexual violence and harassment was not being solved because powerful abusers were being held accountable for their actions. So for every Harvey Weinstein that goes to prison, another Harvey Weinstein is going to take his place unless we address why Harvey Weinstein became Harvey Weinstein in the first place. When I go back to my personal story in prevention, a lot of survivors say that, their abusers are loved ones or people in their community who abuse also do good things. And there's nuance. I do not personally believe, I can't believe that sexual violence exists because evil people perpetuate sexual violence. And if we get rid of the evil people, sexual violence will go away. There are just too many abusers out there. We have to think about what created the conditions where those abusers were validated for their beliefs, were rewarded for their beliefs and behaviors, and got to be in power, and people made excuses for them. That's where kind of we continue with the Me Too movement with prevention.
Yeah, absolutely, Janae. And I want to dig in a little bit deeper into this idea that awareness and knowledge isn't enough. And one way that I like to do that is I always reflect back on this quote from the Institute of Medicine that says, "It is unreasonable to expect that people will change their behavior easily when so many forces in the social, cultural, and physical environment conspire against such change. Ending sexual and intimate partner violence requires that people change their behavior. But in many, many ways, behaviors that create harmful situations are actually rewarded socially and culturally, and oftentimes made easier by our physical environments." So I'm going to give an example and would appreciate you all just participating in this as much or as little as you are comfortable with. But I'm wondering, the images on the screen that are, they're talking about, or they're showing us nutritional choices. If you are familiar with these images over the years, if you would go ahead and just respond in the chat, put a yes in the chat. If these are familiar to you, they've changed over the years, right? So first we had the food pyramid, then we had my pyramid, and now we have my plate. And thank you. It's great that I know, I'm sure that some people maybe did not grow up with the first image like I did. But yeah, at least one of these, hopefully in your lifetime, you've probably been exposed to, for better or for worse, right? We could talk about our thoughts and feelings about these guidelines forever. But my next question to you all is, how many of you, with the information and knowledge you have about like healthy eating, I'm putting on quotation marks because that, changes depending on culture and all sorts of things. How many of you believe that you have the knowledge and information to make good choices that you believe would nourish your body, give you like the brain power that you need? How many of you believe you have that knowledge? Again, you can put a yes in the chat. So you have the knowledge. Great. I'm seeing lots of yeses. Now, last question. How many of you eat that way all the time? I'm seeing my first no's. Right. So you have all the information. You've been educated throughout your life, likely by these public campaigns and also maybe in other places, again, for better or for worse. And so you have the information. You truly believe that you know what would make you feel the best, what would make your body the happiest. And that doesn't mean that you actually make those choices. Okay. So I'll use myself as an example. This is my knowledge. My knowledge is that if I woke up in the morning and fixed myself a beautiful, colorful grain bowl with a nice fresh egg and some healthy avocado, that I probably wouldn't be hungry until lunchtime. I probably wouldn't have that like crash that you get when you just eat like a simple carb for breakfast. I know these things. I believe them, right? I dream of a day where this is 100% my choice. Okay. But here's the other thing you should know about me. My context in life is that I am always not prepared. I'm never prepared for many things. So to eat like this, that would take a lot of planning on my part. I'd have to go to the grocery store. I'd have to meal prep. I'd have to wake up earlier than I already do, right? I have to spend time in the morning. And my context is just that I actually a lot of times don't have that in me for multiple reasons. I saw yes, Diane, and the cost. This is my environment. So I live in a rural community, and to get out of town, I have to go by this shopping center where there's a McDonald's and a Starbucks. They're both drive-throughs. Okay, so my environment makes it really easy for me to take what I know about a healthy breakfast and actually have a different behavior. And so even though I have the knowledge that a breakfast veggie and grain bowl would be the best choice for me, there's a lot of things that sway me away from that behavior. And so if we relate this back to violence, it could look like this. We can give people a ton of information and education. We can raise all the awareness that we have, and we should be doing that, right? But it's going to take more for people to change their behavior. And I used to do a lot of work with youth, and I'd spend, weeks on end with them every day, an hour or two. And the goal with those relationships was really to reduce sexual harassment in their school. And we'd have like really awesome conversations. One of the conversations we would have a lot was what they felt like in most other areas of their lives. And a lot of what I heard was that behavior was being normalized and sometimes even celebrated by their peers, by their older siblings, by pop culture, and sometimes even the adults in their lives. And so while I had given them a ton of information and they were really feeling like that was important to them, when they left that environment, they were faced with all of these other social, cultural, and environmental impacts that would make it so they might choose a different behavior, even though they knew that wasn't the best choice for them. I want to think about this a little bit more and walk you through another scenario. So this cartoon on the screen is tackling a different public health issue. Specifically, this one is looking at diabetes. But I think it's also a nice way to illustrate environments and behavior change. So our friend here, our little cartoon friend, his name is Fred, and we're going to pretend that I am Fred's doctor, and Fred's one of my patients. And I'm telling Fred that he really needs to adopt some healthy behaviors, and he needs to do his best to stop the unhealthy ones in order to help manage his diabetes. And so as his doctor, I'm going to give him an easy to follow schedule for taking his medication. And I'm also going to give him a brochure on healthy eating tips. But as his doctor, I'm not going home with Fred, right? Like that relationship stops when Fred walks out of the door. And I'm not going to be by his side throughout his day as he's faced with making decisions. The fact is that Fred is part of a larger community. He's part of a family, he's part of a neighborhood, he's part of a culture. And those things are all going to affect how he behaves and what decisions that he makes. So in order to best help Fred, we need to be able to promote healthy behaviors throughout the environment that he lives in. So for example, Fred might be more likely to take his medication if the people in his social circle know his schedule and can help remind him. He might be more likely to eat fresh food if there's fresh food available at the corner market in his neighborhood. He might be more likely to get the daily exercise that his doctor recommended if his health insurance includes something like a gym membership. So what I'm trying to illustrate is that there are lots of ways for us to support Fred throughout the environment he lives, plays, and works in. But what happens if Fred lives in an environment where he doesn't have access to fresh food? There's only liquor stores. What if Fred lives in a community where there's a lack of jobs that pay a living wage and offer health insurance? What if Fred lives in a neighborhood where nobody talks to one another because they're too busy just trying to get by, right? And get their basic needs met. Even if Fred wants to make changes to live a healthier life, he's really limited due to the lack of opportunities and resources available to him. And this next slide kind of further illustrates that. I think we're all well aware that not all environments are created equally, and a long history, as Janae pointed out, of oppression through things like our laws, policies, and practices have created environments where some people, based solely on their identity, have less resources to health. And so this illustration with these two fish bowls helps me think about the way that our environments can really limit our ability to have the highest quality of life possible when the environments that we live in are not built for us to thrive. So just a couple more examples on the way that our environments really shapes our attitudes, our beliefs, and our actions.
Thanks, Ashley. So when we're taking into account environments, that also means that not all solutions are the same. We're going to talk a little bit about community-based solutions to violence and to prevention, and we have some resources to follow that learning. But like Ashley mentioned, where she lives, talking about eating healthy and getting a nutritious breakfast, she drives past a McDonald's and a Starbucks. And so an environmental change could be putting in a smoothie place there that is affordable, or addressing inflation. I know every time I go to the grocery store, it costs me like $100, and I'm like, I should just get ramen. But what Ashley experiences in her community is not the same thing that I experience in my community. We don't have drive-throughs in my community. Sometimes I don't know how I feel about that, but that was something that was changed a few years ago. And so I don't find myself going to McDonald's or to Starbucks as much. I do, however, have an order ahead app at Starbucks, and so I end up going quite often. So when we talk about environmental solutions, we have to think about where we are, what makes up an environment. We just talked about physical things that make up an environment, what buildings are there, what businesses are there, how much greenery is in an environment. We also need to talk about cultural norms in environments. What are people around you doing? What are people talking about? What kind of behaviors are people uplifting? We also need to talk about different laws and policies. So these are two examples. One is a more rural community, one is a more urban community, and prevention in these two spaces are going to look different. They're going to be through threads here, but there's going to be different things as well. And so part of prevention is also knowing your community, knowing your community members, and designing solutions that are individualized, that are personalized, and that feel impactful. So we would love to hear from you all. What are some things in your environments that promote or prevent violence? And you can think about general things, or you can think about really specific to your community. I will share, being in San Luis Obispo, we have a really big university here, Cal Poly University. And a friend of mine works at Cal Poly doing sexual violence prevention. She works with the architecture department to redesign some of the dorms, to talk about what kind of dorm layouts would promote more healthy communication, more seating options so that it's not just a bed, looking at things like that. In my community, because it's a really big college town, we have a lot of bars. We have a really big nightlife scene, and that might not exist where Ashley lives. I see things that promote are like music and media. Yeah, that totally can. It can also prevent social isolation. We don't know our neighbors. Yeah, we're going to talk about things that make sexual violence more likely to happen, least likely to happen, and community connection is a huge piece. I see university and college life, community collaboration. I see lots of rural towns. Mental health professionals are hard to find. Unsafe neighborhoods, lack of public transit options. Absolutely. Other things like lighting or cultural norms or, political backgrounds. There's so many things that contribute to people's beliefs. Access to therapy and crisis services, community values, work culture, under-resourced public schools, all really, really valid. Thank you for sharing. And I would imagine that while some people experience a lot of things in their communities, there are also some that maybe some communities have and others don't.
Thanks, Janae. And I have to call out a fellow Ashley in the chat who brought up a protective factor in their community that is new, a community garden with a larger library that has activities for kids and families. So I think what the promise of prevention is, when we identify these things in our communities that are making things not safe, that are creating conditions where people are really struggling to just have their basic needs met or to have a higher quality of life, how do we turn those things around? How do we switch that? We are noticing that there's a ton of social isolation. What are things that we could maybe implement that could increase social connection? That is an example of sexual and intimate partner violence prevention. So there's as many things in here that we can be like, oh yeah, that's horrible, that's terrible, that's a bummer. How do we flip those things and see that there is actually a promise of being able to make change? And one of the ways that we talk about this is we think about how can we make the biggest impact? A lot of us in here might be doing classroom presentations, which are so important. That's how so many people come into this work, right? We learn about this work through something like that. At the same time, how many classroom presentations are we going to have to do to reach the entire population, right? Do we have the capacity for that? Do we have enough people in this work doing that? Do we have enough money to do that? Or could we also be doing things where we can impact entire communities of people and they don't necessarily have to participate to be impacted? So an example of that could be there's some work happening on the East Coast where there are communities that have parks available to them, but the park have become places where people don't feel safe, right? So there's broken down, swing sets, and there's no lights and there's nowhere for people to sit and have conversations. And so the parks have become something else where people don't feel safe, don't necessarily want to go there. And so some of the people who are doing prevention there have said, wonder if we bring the community together and beautify this park, right? Make this park look nicer, clean it up, put in a light, put in some benches for people to be able to hang out and talk to one another, put in a tree. And so not only in that instance will the people that actually utilize the park be impacted, but just the people that drive by and see it and can say that, oh, there's a nice park in my neighborhood, right? There's something that we feel proud of when we are part of things that are are welcoming, and make people feel like they belong and like they're a part of something. So I think that that is an important kind of discussion point, is to think about, how do we have the biggest impact? How do we choose strategies that are going to impact people without them necessarily knowing that they're being impacted? So things like policy change or big environmental changes or social norms campaigns, those things can all lead to widespread adoption and behavior change. And we don't necessarily have to like have a one-on-one individual interaction with someone to make that happen.
Thanks, Ashley. So, kind of going off of what Ashley was sharing, we use this piece. You might hear it called the social ecological model, or the SEM, in a lot of spaces, especially public health spaces. That's just a term, I don't want you to feel like super hung up on that term, but it's something that we use to talk about different strategies that impact people at different levels, starting with individuals. So that's what Ashley just talked about, and getting kind of bigger and bigger and bigger. And you see that every circle exists within the circle that surrounds it. So individual, if you work on an individual level, it just impacts the individual. If you work on a relationship level, it impacts relationships and individual. Community impacts all three, and societal impacts society, community, relationship, and individual. This was one of the first things that I saw in my 65-hour training that I did in 2019. And I was like, what does this have to do with prevention? This makes no sense to me. And this is kind of how we want to explain it. So talking about the individual level, so that's really awareness, education, and giving knowledge. That's what Ashley was talking about with those school presentations. And I will say, when I was doing local prevention work, I did comprehensive sex ed, and it was one of the best things that I've ever done. And I absolutely loved it. And the great thing about it was, whenever I went in and did a 2-week-long presentation with students, I left feeling like I made a difference. I could see a change in people. That's why individual level responses are really popular, because we can feel the change that we're making. In my community, it wasn't even necessarily about funding or how many people were on our prevention team. We had a pretty large prevention team, but not all schools wanted us there. So we had some schools in part of our county that we were in multiple times a year, that students were really into it, that they had a pretty healthy culture on campus. We had other schools who wouldn't let us in at all. We had other schools who would let us come in for a one-day presentation on healthy relationships, but wouldn't let us do anything else. And so people were getting an inequitable access to knowledge and information, and we weren't making the same change everywhere. I also could not be everywhere at once. We had a population, there are so many students, so many teenagers out there, and I, as one person, cannot reach all of them. Going a little bit bigger to relationship level responses, these are things like bystander intervention, healthy relationship skill building, and parenting workshops. Again, really important. These strategies should still be a part of prevention approaches. They just don't need to be the only thing. With a parenting workshop, I love hosting parenting workshops, but I can't make all parents get there, especially because of things like Ashley was sharing about with nutrition. How can I ask parents to come to a parenting workshop when they're working full time and they're parenting 3 kids, and it falls during their dinner time, or they're really busy, or they're really tired, or they can't take on another thing, or they have their own beliefs and values that have been instilled in them over a long period of time? There are bigger factors that just skill building is not going to change. We zoom out a little bit further, and that's where we start looking at the soil and what's in the soil. So things like social norms. And when I say social norms, I mean, those are things that our society considers normal. So I saw some stuff in here about our ideas of what it means to be a real man, or why sexual violence happens, or what women should wear and do and what that means, or gender roles. Also things like social supports. So when we talked about housing and job security and resources in the community, those are those environmental changes and resources that we can impact. And we don't need to know every single person in the community in order to affect change. And then societal, those are the big things, right? Like that's the United States, as we're in the United States right now, the laws and policies that impact people. So what does that actually look like in practice? So now that we know what the social ecological model is, what are some of the strategies that kind of fall into each one of those buckets? So the Centers for Disease Control names specific factors that affect the likelihood that someone either perpetrates or experiences violence. And I saw this in the chat a little bit. We call those risk and protective factors. Again, those are kind of big terminologies, but basically risk factors increase the likelihood of violence and protective factors decrease the likelihood of violence. So one increases risk, one increases protection. And when we talk about what those factors are, those are kind of the reasons that violence happens. And these are really helpful, I think, especially from a foundational point, because it's some tangible pieces that we can impact. You know, if you just told me prevent sexual violence, I wouldn't really know what to do. But if you told me that lack of nonviolent social problem solving skills increases the likelihood of sexual violence, I can be like, great. So if I teach more nonviolent social problem solving skills, then I can make a difference. On the individual level, the CDC names lack of nonviolent social problem skills, poor behavioral control and impulsiveness, history of violent victimization, witnessing violence, and substance abuse as some of the individual things that could increase the likelihood of violence. Moving up to the relationship level, the CDC names poor parent and child relationships, family conflict, associating with delinquent peers, gang involvement, all as factors that increase the likelihood of violence. The CDC also names that connection and commitment to school is a protective factor. So I can say, okay, if I can make school a better place where all students feel connected and they want to be involved, I can, maybe move the needle so that less violence happens. Zooming out once again to community level solutions to violence, the CDC names neighborhood poverty, community violence, and diminished economic opportunities or high levels of employment, all as risk factors that increase the likelihood of violence. I can work to affect each one of those things in my community and make a big difference. It names, and someone mentioned this earlier, community support and connectedness as a protective factor. That was my big strategy that I focused in on when I did community level prevention, was community connectedness. Ashley mentioned parks that can increase community connectedness, murals, social norms campaigns, more events, more youth-centered events. So those can all increase community connection. And then on society level, the CDC names cultural norms that support aggression, media violence, and weak health, educational, economic, and social policies, all as risk factors, as well as harmful norms around masculinity and femininity. So again, if we're working in the societal, we're also affecting community, relationship, and individual. That's the benefit. Now, the best strategies don't just pick one of these. They're working at multiple levels of the social ecological model. An example to this that I like to use are seatbelts. So seatbelts are kind of considered one of the big examples of why a public health approach works. When our lawmakers wanted people to use seatbelts a lot more, when people weren't using seatbelts, they passed a law saying seatbelt usage was mandatory. Did that make everyone use seatbelts overnight? It didn't. A lot of people didn't think that we needed seatbelts. There was like some shame in seatbelt using. There was people who didn't think that it was that important. People were busy. It wasn't something that we practiced for a long time. That policy was only put into place a few decades ago. So they didn't stop there. The CDC took it on as a public health problem. Seatbelts were considered a public health problem So not only did we pass laws requiring seatbelt usage, they also did a lot of social norms campaigns. We saw a lot of commercials coming out and billboards, check your child's seatbelt fit in every vehicle. And there's some more information on the CDC website about their approach to using seatbelts. Another example that I like to use is smoking. So that is something, smoking used to be normalized. And then at some point we decided we are not going to normalize smoking anymore. That's a harmful behavior that hurts people and their health and communities. And we saw a lot of different approaches to mitigating smoking. We've all seen the anti-smoking campaign, the ugly truth campaigns. We saw people come in and doing individual level education in schools. We saw commercials. We saw big campaigns like the ugly truth. We also saw policy changes. So increasing the age of how old people need to be to buy cigarettes. There are laws distinguishing how far stores that sell cigarettes need to be away from schools. Not any one of those things solves smoking, but all of them put together are supposed to make it harder to get cigarettes and change our community norms and our social norms around smoking. My mom grew up, she's in her 70s now, and she's a chain smoker, and she's had a really hard time quitting smoking. And we talk often about when she grew up, smoking was cool. Everyone smoked. She started smoking in high school, and it's really hard for her to quit now, versus I grew up in the 90s where a lot of this really started happening. I never really thought smoking was cool. I knew that it was going to hurt me. And I know that things are getting better for kids now. We're talking about vaping and the impacts, and there are a lot of things that are happening to mitigate smoking.
Thanks, Janae. And I wanted to just highlight a comment in the chat by Bernadette. Said that it's important to note that this is not a comprehensive list of risk and protective factors. This is what we know from limited research. Absolutely, Bernadette. Thank you so much for that point. There's so much more that we need to understand when it comes to risk and protective factors, especially protective factors, especially around perpetration. So yeah, we can take what we have and use it, and also know that there's a lot more that we need to know and understand. So a couple of examples from ways that people are making changes that we wanted to share with you would be, when we're trying to implement changes or to create protective environments in communities, a lot of times historically what's happened is that a professionalized organization will go into a community and say, we have this program for you. You need this in order to make X, Y, and Z better. And as you can imagine, that's pretty condescending when we just go into a community and try to tell them what they need. So what's been really exciting to see are people doing prevention work who are actually working with communities for communities, either as part of the community or really letting the community take leadership and ownership of the prevention strategies. And so we have a couple of examples that I'll put links in the chat in just a moment, but some really incredible work happening in New Jersey, working with community to really change social norms and create environments where men are really engaged, not just as allies, but as agents of change. And then we also know that when it comes to changing things like laws and policies and practices that have been around forever, community is also really essential in that community knows how they've been most impacted and often already have the solutions. And so we have some lessons learned from doing work with community leadership and resilience that we'll share. And some other examples of people who are actually doing more policy level work. This comes directly from California, where Janae and I are located. But here in California, janitorial workers who are primarily working like the overnight shifts, cleaning like large business spaces, we're experiencing really high rates of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And so they actually were able to influence and change policy to be able to provide training to other janitorial workers and businesses who are hiring them on sexual harassment prevention. And they actually create the curriculum and implement that training, which is kind of it's not just a policy, but it's also the example from before. They are community working with community. Also here in California, our sister organization, the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, has done a lot of intimate partner violence prevention using a strategy to enhance access to paid family leave across the state. And so while California had paid family leave, a lot of people did not realize that they were eligible for it. And so the partnership has done a lot of work to let people know what the eligibility is, translate that into other languages, and really be able to increase people's access to taking something that could really keep some families from experiencing poverty. When we talk about addressing the root causes of violence, so those are the things that, Janae shared with us about the systems of oppression. We're not necessarily saying that everyone in here now needs to like become an activist. Well, no, okay, we do need to become those things. What I'm trying to say is that in order to address root causes of violence, it's essential for us to expand our understanding of prevention and partner with social justice movements that are already happening and that are already doing work to dismantle systems of oppression. So that is one thing that's really, I think, important. How can we give of our resources and time to those movements that are already on the ground doing incredible things? And then how do we take that and look at how our own organizations and our own programs and policies are replicating systems of oppression? There's a lot of work that we can be doing within our own selves and our own organizations to address root causes of violence. And I think sometimes we think because we're doing this work, we're like protected from that, but we all know that we're not, that there's a lot of work to be done within our own work and organizations. And there's lots of resources about how to do that and examples of how people are both partnering with other movements to dismantle things like racism, and also to look at how their policies and practices as an organization over the years have contributed to racism. And then we have a lot of resources around increasing health equity. So in this idea that people need access to resources in order to live the healthiest lives possible, and that a history of racism and oppression has created environments where no matter how hard someone might try to reach their optimal level of health, the soil is poison, as we revert back to that metaphor. So we'll put some links in the chat if you are interested in learning more about a health equity approach to preventing sexual and intimate partner violence as well. And then we'd love to just know, what are some of the things that you're doing in your communities to prevent violence? What are some of the strategies that you're implementing, that you're excited about? What does that look like? There's such a wealth of information in a Zoom room of over 300 people, so it'd be exciting to hear from you all. So we'll let you answer some of that. And while you do that, I think we just have a couple more resources, and then Janae, I'll see if you can pull some things out of the chat, but we do have a whole series of e-learning courses. If you're interested in continuing to build your capacity around prevention, there's beginner, intermediate, and advanced courses, and you can take those at your own pace and receive a certificate. And then we are part of a larger network of national partners who have really incredible resources around primary prevention. So this is one resource, a primary prevention primer. It's also an e-learning tool that is out of the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And then, of course, CDC has some really important and incredible research that is available. These actually got rebranded. They're not called technical packages anymore, so we'll have to make an update to that. They are now called resources for action, but there are, I believe, 6 of them. So there is one specifically around intimate partner violence, there's one about sexual violence, and then there's also child abuse and neglect, I think youth violence, suicide. There's more. We'll put a link to where you can find all of those. And then Violence Prevention in Practice is another really great website where you can kind of explore different strategies and approaches. Janae, I'm going to pass it over to you and see what's been coming up in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. A lot of really cool things coming up in the chat. So I'm seeing implementing coaching boys into men, which is a great it's a great proven strategy to prevent violence that focuses on empowering leaders in young boys' lives. I see peer-to-peer advocacy, empowering girls. All of these are also kind of listed in those technical packages that Ashley mentions as some of the strategies that you can use if you're not sure what those are. I see working on bystander stuff. I see drum circles for men, so culturally responsive solutions and prevention strategies. I see some awareness stuff, creating safe spaces for youth of all identities, youth engagement and leadership and empowerment, encouraging early conversations, working with parents, grandparents, and grownups. Love that. Affecting the environments that kids grow up in. Creating summer programming and parks for families with young children. That's so cool. I see some school-based stuff. I see Green Dot. I see podcasting. We know we love a good podcast. See some community-based stuff about empowering and building people up. Let's see, Arnetta says they've developed an app, which is really cool. Would love to hear more about that, Arnetta. Sisterhood circles, elementary stuff, Teal Talks, providing support and education. Absolutely, absolutely. We really appreciate, please continue to put these in the chat. And I know the chat has been lighting up, so I'm going to kind of transition to talking about what happens now. If you haven't been able to keep up with the chat, that's okay. We do send out the chat afterwards, so you can always check back at PreventConnect.org and we'll have the chat transcript available because people are putting so many great resources in here. We will also be sending out, as we bring this web conference to a close, we will be sending out the recording after this web conference. You'll get that through your email. You'll also be getting a chance to take an eval of this web conference. It'll take like 5 minutes. That's how you can get your certificate of completion. It should pop up when you close your Zoom room. I will also be sending that out afterwards as well. And we will be putting the PowerPoint slides, the recording, and the text transcript all at PreventConnect.org in our past web conference tab up there. So we want to thank you all so much for being here. We know we covered a lot in almost 90 minutes. Really encourage you to take advantage of those resources that Ashley mentioned, because as we said, this is really just the foundation basic building blocks of prevention. And we hope that this serves as a springboard for your continued learning. But if anyone has any questions or anything, please feel free to put them in the chat. And we just really deeply appreciate you all for being here. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording.